Hi everyone, Ariel here today with another video. This one is the second part of the series that I promised to do, taking the principles from my video on intentional versus as the inspirational writers and using everything I discussed there in a practical way. So today's video is the second part discussing outlining. So I've pulled up here the file that we used last time to do the brainstorming, and that will be linked in the upper corner. So today we're going to be expanding upon what I did in the last video to create the outline. As you can see, I have added one theme here that wasn't on here before and actually is completely different from everything else that I did to demonstrate brainstorming in the last video. As I said, I had to think about what I was going to do a little bit more, and as I was doing some more reading in the outlet's recent publications, it came to my attention that the majority of their focus has been on individual rights, the COVID-19 situation, and government overreach in those areas. So since that is kind of the focus that they've been taking, I wanted to sort of mirror that, since that's obviously what the publication is interested in discussing right now. I want to make sure that my article is something that is timely and that fits in with the rest of the discussion. As a result, this is the theme that I decided to go with: fear responses and government overreach. I have two different directions that I could go in the article based off of this theme, and one of them is to discuss the danger of the fear response to individual rights, and the second is to focus in on government use of the fear response to rob the individual of his rights. I think that for the purposes of this particular article, I am going to focus mainly on this second one, because I think it's more in line with what the publication is focusing on right now, which is the reasons why the response to COVID-19 has not been appropriate. And so this is the one that we're going to go with to form the outline. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my writing software here. Okay, I apparently pinned the wrong version of this. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. Go ahead and pin the correct one to my taskbar. All right, so we're working with nonfiction here. We are doing, doesn't really matter for the purposes of this one. We'll go with the essay in Chicago style. For now, I'm just going to name this according to what it actually is, just a practical name. I can change that later once I have an actual title for the article, but for now, we're not at that point. Okay, so you guys could do this process in any program that's a word processing program or a writing program. I personally tend to use Scrivener as my particular writing program, so that's what I use, which means that it is easier for me to just go ahead and use the program that I know. I do also use Word, but I find that I prefer this one for organizing notes. So that is what we're going to go ahead and start with. Just get this set up here. I switched over to a new laptop recently because my old one is not charging properly, and there's something wrong with the actual charging port itself, not recognizing the cord properly, I think, and it was just getting sort of outdated. So the unfortunate thing about that is that all of my programs, even though they are installed, they are not all updated to the settings that I normally use, so I end up having to go in here and fix them. Okay, so the first thing that is going to go up here on my screen right away is that theme. And I'm going to grab the more specific one because this is what we're going to use to decide what goes in here and what doesn't. Keep in mind that this is all ad-libbed, guys, so if I'm quiet for a few, it's because I'm thinking. Okay, so now that I've got my theme in here, I need to determine how I'm going to open this. The most logical thing to do in terms of opening an essay like this would probably be to begin with a discussion of the two types of fear responses in the COVID-19 situation. We are going to frame it with the COVID-19 situation as our current event example, but I think I will be using some historical examples later on in the article because I think that we should have some support for the theme that goes beyond just what's going on right now, because that doesn't prove that this is not an exception to the rule. So let's see. Our first point is going to be a discussion of the two types of fear responses. Now, as I have been researching this publication, they tend to be pretty even-handed in pointing out the problems with both sides. So they do seem to prioritize approaching things, obviously, from an objectivist perspective rather than from a specifically liberal or specifically Republican perspective. And if you actually analyze the viewpoint that they're taking, the viewpoint has a mix of more liberal agenda items and some more conservative agenda items. They don't necessarily see those as being clashing ideals. And as I'm familiar with the actual philosophical underpinnings of this, perhaps not as familiar as the editors of the publication, but still familiar enough to know that they do have a pretty good argument for why the two are not necessarily in conflict with each other. So, because the publication prizes objectivity and wants to look at things from a rational perspective, we really do need to not focus on just one side of the aisle here, hence discussing the two types of fear responses. So our first point is going to be the liberal fear response. Underneath that point, let's see. Underneath that point, I want to focus on fear. How do I want to put this? Government-generated fear of mortality rates associated with COVID-19. Keep in mind, guys, that when you are doing your outline, it doesn't have to be perfect. This is meant to give you the chance to work out the ideas that you want to focus on. So once you've kind of gotten used to how you work with outlines, you can determine how much you need or don't need in the outline. You can also determine how closely you personally need to stick to the outline in order to stay on topic. But you shouldn't view the outline as something that's prescriptive. So if you're writing and it doesn't feel right, take the time to assess why it doesn't feel right and change it if need be. So I'm not taking this as a prescriptive outline that this is 100% the way that it's going to be worded or the way that it's going to be handled in the essay, but this is sort of getting everything together, getting everything lined up so that it works properly. So the second point that I probably want to discuss briefly underneath this first point is probably the leap to fear of fellow citizens who don't comply with government demands. So we want to make it specific that it is government demands here. Okay, this is not indenting here. Sorry, I am a little picky about my formatting here. It drives me absolutely nuts if the formatting is not turning out right. It just messes me up. So I'm going to take a second here to fix this quickly. Just go ahead and make sure that these are properly formatted so that it doesn't distract me as I am moving forward in the outline. I just like everything really organized. If it doesn't bother you guys, then don't worry about it when you're doing your outline. Just only worry about it if it is genuinely something that is going to distract you from the process and bug you. which I personally know that this will do. So just one more to fix this so that it sits properly in here. Sorry about that, guys. I hit the wrong button. I'm still getting used to the keyboard here, and the delete button is right next to the power button. So well placed. Okay, so I'm not entirely sure why this one is not. There we go. Okay, so we've got 2 different points under here. After I've got the main points out there, I'm probably going to go back and add in some examples that I might want to use. But for now, that's good enough. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to point number 2. Maybe. Sorry, everybody. This is not working exactly as intended. Go ahead and scoot things around just to make sure that it sits right in here, because like I said, I am just really picky about this. If you guys are not picky about it, then don't worry about doing this. This is totally a me thing and the way that I work. So do not feel obligated to do your outline in the same way that I do. I can't stress that enough. You want to do your outline in a way that works for you, because what works for me may not work for you, and the last thing you want to do is get stuck because you didn't outline things in a way that worked for you. Or you used a program that just didn't work for you. Let me go ahead and change this to no. Okay. All right. We'll just go ahead and move that down. See if this addresses the issue. Hopefully. It doesn't. All right, we'll just leave it as a 1 then, because I'm not going to mess around with this further. Okay. It hates me. All right. You can tell that I don't normally use the outlining functions in here. This is not normally how I would do an outline necessarily, unless it is required to be done that way by the teacher. I personally hate doing outlines this way. But my normal outlining process would not be clear at all for you guys, so for your sakes, I am doing this a little bit differently than I normally would, because I want to make sure that it is actually super clear. Okay, well, this first point is going to look like it's duplicated here, but it is what it is. So, moving forward now, after the fiasco with technological difficulties, we're now going to discuss the conservative fear response. Because like I said, we want to make sure we're balanced about this approach and that we are not just, bashing on one side, because that's not the point of the publication. They're relatively even-handed about how they handle the coverage of both sides, and both sides have things they do that are problematic. So, in this case, we want to probably focus on how do I want to put this? We're still gonna go with the same response here, that it is government generated fear, but it is of vaccines in particular. So government generated fear of vaccines for COVID-19, that tends to be more of a conservative issue than it is a liberal one. We're going to talk here about the leap not to fear of fellow citizens, but to disdain of fellow citizens who choose differently. So actually, I'm going to add in a third point here, because it's not necessarily just leap to fear, but also leap from fear to a sense of moral superiority to those who refuse to comply, because that's also kind of an important thing. And in this case, we're going to go here also with the leap to fear-based conspiracies about government and COVID-19 treatments. It's probably more in line with what we've got in the previous section, and we want to kind of parallel the discussion points here. So our last one would be the leap, I can't spell tonight apparently, the leap from fear to, again, a sense of moral superiority to those who comply. We're going to go with that because that's a good way to kind of put it and parallel the structures. Why are all of these ones? I really want to know why none of these seem to... Okay. Well, that is a very bad way to handle the list. But fine. Okay. So now that we're done discussing the two types of fear responses, we're ready for our next point. Okay, this one also does the same thing. That's really annoying. Ignore the fact that these look like they're the same points. They're not. Okay, so now that we've got the preliminary discussion out of the way, going back to our theme, which, to remind everyone, is government use of the fear response to rob the individual of his rights, we want to move from talking about the two types of fear responses, because that's kind of laying the groundwork for what specifically we're going to talk about, to, let's see, how is the best way to word this? A discussion of past and present government use of fear of force and fear tactics to ensure a compliant citizenry. That's the best way to word this. So our first point would be past government use of force or violence and fear tactics to ensure a compliant citizenry. Under this, I'm going to put in the example of Germany, specifically, I'm probably going to spell this wrong. I'm taking German and I still can't spell it. It's awesome. Ignore the fact that this is not spelled right. I'm not going to. I'm going to try to fix it. That's... okay, it just doesn't like the fact that there's not an S on the end, apparently. So we're going to focus on specifically the Reichstag fire and Hitler's tactics to turn German citizens against his against groups he disliked. So this would include Jews. That's the best known group, but also the Dutch communists. That one was that would be in specific reference to this first point here, or this first example. Let's see. Blacks were unfortunately another group that was really discriminated against, and so were gays. I guess that's not technically the right term, but that is the historical term that was used, I suppose, for it. So that's what we'll go with, since that's the example we're giving. Let's see. Other examples that I might want to use. This one might not be the best way to word it because it's not exactly what I'm thinking. So let's go ahead and revise this a little. Use of force. I think the better way to put this would be a use of crisis. Real or manufactured. Because not all of these examples were actual real crises, but they were made to appear so by the individual who was using them for political power. Russia, the issue, there was a very real crisis of political unrest and abuse by the Russian Tsar. So political unrest and abuse by the Russian Tsar is one example that I might want to use there. Tactics, I might want to also, under this, discuss the tactics that Stalin employed to instill fear and we'll call it a tattletale mentality. But really, it's just, when I say that, I just mean the mentality that your neighbor is a danger to you if they don't comply with the system, as well as a sense of moral superiority if you tattle on your neighbor to the government for things that they, are doing that you don't think they should be. I think for the 1,500 words that I have, we're probably good to just briefly focus on these two examples. I think if I tried to focus on anything more, I wouldn't have room in the article to really give it the attention that it needs. And the point here is to provide support and backdrop to give evidence that this current situation is not a new situation or, a fluke. And I think that's important to demonstrate. So I want to make sure that it's in there. And so that is enough reason to include it in there. It's not a rabbit trail. It's not, a side trail that is going to sidetrack the reader. There is a point to having it in there, and it does need to be there to provide that backdrop. But I don't want to focus on it too heavily and take away from the main point, which is present government use of a crisis, real or manufactured, and fear tactics to ensure a compliant citizenry. Okay, under this one, we want to talk about the mandates that are in place right now. Well, first we want to talk about the rhetoric, I suppose, surrounding the vaccines early on versus now, because I think that's an important point to discuss. I'm going to specify that this is political rhetoric, because this was not necessarily what we were hearing initially. Early on, the rhetoric we were hearing from our politicians didn't necessarily mirror what people were talking about on the ground level. Tactics to turn one group against another. discrimination on the basis of treatment or non-treatment, claims that blow the data and statistics out of proportion, doom and gloom, use of the media to convince everyone we're all going to die if we don't comply. These two all sort of actually fall under one subheader. They're not really points necessarily to themselves, they're more examples rather than an actual discussion topic. So I'm going to put them underneath a header that actually fits with what they are to discuss or what they're there for to discuss. We probably want to cover what a compliant citizenry means for individual rights, because again, if we go back to our entire point here, it's government use of the fear response to rob the individual of his rights. And so we've got this discussion that we're having of how they've used crisis past and present to ensure a compliant citizenry, but why do they want that? What does that mean for our topic? So maybe in this we want to specify the rights of the individual as part of the discussion. And so maybe we're going to close out this section with discussing why does it matter if the government ensures a fear-ridden, compliant citizenry. Now, I think that based off of the earlier points, it should by this time be pretty clear why, so I should only have to really summarize. I shouldn't have to write what would essentially amount to an article in and of itself. But we're going to go ahead and summarize here. Bring it all home. So we're going to start with the fact that a compliant and fearful citizenry is more likely to turn to the government for protection at the cost of individual rights, which grants the government more control. A compliant and fearful citizenry is also more likely to turn a blind eye when those who won't comply are punished and robbed of their rights, which is something that can be historically supported. I want to cut down on words here. Okay, and then the final point that we want to make is that government, if not properly constrained by an informed citizenry, is left free to pursue its own interests. over that of the citizens. Under that point, to clarify it maybe, citizens become property of the government rather than the government being property of the citizens. So rule by the people versus rule by tyranny. Okay, and this is kind of predicated on the idea here that individual rights are paramount. As Ayn Rand famously once said, the individual is the smallest minority. So if we're interested in truly protecting minority rights, individual rights are the most important rights we can guarantee. Yes, I am ignoring the technical rules for an outline by not having a B here, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on. Oh, now it actually decides to work. That's lovely. Okay, I guess I just needed to start out with a proper outline structure instead of typing it in on my own and hoping it would auto-correct itself. Okay, so the final point that we want is our conclusion. And that's going to be the proper response to the COVID-19 situation predicated on reason. Because that's a big thing for the publication, is that whenever they discuss these kinds of things, they always want to talk about what the proper response is. So the first thing that we want to probably put on here as a response to both fear responses, because it's equally valid for both, is get the actual facts. And always double check your sources. It's the first thing. Because we can't make good decisions if we don't have accurate information and a good view of reality in order to base our understanding on. Address false ultimatums. There's probably a better and more philosophical way to put that I should find when I actually write the journal article. Maybe. But address false ultimatums, which is basically just the idea that you have to have either or. So false, either the fallacy, address either or fallacies. It's probably the best way to do it in the thinking on both sides, because there is an either or fallacy here on both sides that probably should be addressed. And then probably I think we'd want to close out with a discussion that individual rights come first, whether you like how the other person exercises them or not. And the kind of follow-up maybe that might want to be pointed out in this particular point's discussion is that by definition, individual rights cannot be exercised if it requires a show of force to make someone else do as you wish. So that probably maybe needs a tiny bit more explanation, but not much, because the audience, oh, I didn't spell this right, because the audience is familiar at least with the basic premises of Rand and her philosophy. So I don't think this needs a lot of explanation in the same way as it would on, say, my own blog, which is more focused on a wide spectrum of people who not only may or may not agree with me, but also probably don't have the same basis as I do. So taking the time to explain or at least link to other articles that do explain is important there because of the difference in audience. In this case, the audience is going to be mostly people who already know where the publication is coming from and don't need me to sit there and philosophize. Is that the right word? Philosophize regarding individual rights and Rand's particular view on them. My view as well. So we don't need that there. So we'll just kind of leave it at this. So we want to also end this with the point that any exercise of government authority that abridges individual rights is a violation of individual rights and wrongful use of authority. Wrongful. That's maybe not exactly what I want to say. It's a violation of individual rights, certainly, but the point that maybe I'm trying to make is that it's outside of the purview of government purpose. Okay, so I think that this probably clarifies my last point. Individual rights come first, whether you like how the other person uses them or not, and are the measuring stick in deciding how to respond when considering government action. And then these 2 points would be kind of underneath this closing response. So I think that that's kind of good. This is the conclusion, so I'll just mark this so it's super clear in my outline that this is the conclusion. So that's the process that you kind of want to follow when you're working with outlines. As you can see here, we started with my theme before we touched anything else. That's super important because, as you probably noticed as I was talking through this, the theme was the yardstick by which I measured what should and shouldn't go in here and what needed to be here. So because I'm looking at this and thinking about my theme as well as the specific angle at which I'm going to approach the theme, I was able to determine that it is necessary to open up with discussing the 2 different types of fear responses that we're seeing right now. Because people are not going to automatically necessarily identify that, and they may be able to identify it for the other side because we can always find something wrong with people we don't agree with, but they're not necessarily going to find what's wrong with their own side. So if we're going to take an objective stance about this, a stance that is based on being rational, we have to look at both sides, both our own and the other, in order to determine what the problems are, if any, and address those. But once we've got the background information out of the way so that everybody understands exactly what we're talking about here in regard to the use of fear response, and what those fear responses are in this case, we have to actually get into the discussion about the government use of the fear response, which goes along with the government use of a crisis. So that kind of defines my second point here for me. I didn't, I had to think about it a little bit, but I knew that that was going to need to be talked about. So it was just a matter of determining where it would go logically in the discussion and exactly which examples I wanted to use maybe. Now, obviously, the outline will need to be fleshed out when I go to do the actual paper. We're sitting here at 486 words. I expect that this paper is going to be about 1,500, which is the limit for the class assignment. So, and it's generally speaking a pretty good measuring stick to use for most outlets these days. They're not publishing 4,500 word blog articles unless you're me. But even I split them down into numerous parts in some cases where it makes sense. So, given that, I had to make sure that what I'm including here, the bulk of the discussion, is focused on my theme. But I also wanted to make sure that when I'm discussing the theme, I am also making it clear why it matters, because that's important too. You can't just leave out the why. The why is the most important thing about the entire article, so that also helps to define, as you're looking at your theme, that tells you exactly what you need to explain in regards to what exactly is it that we're supposed to care about. What is it that defines the why in particular that we're talking about in this case? So in this case, then it would be, why does it matter that the government uses a fear response to rob the individual of his rights? Who cares? What is the effect to society if that happens? And then obviously we don't want to just leave everybody with doom and gloom in something like this, so we want to discuss what is the actual appropriate response that both sides ought to be having to this issue if we want to avoid all the problems that are in this last section of the second point. So I think that this should hopefully be a pretty good example for you guys of exactly how the outlining process works. If you have any questions regarding how I did this, feel free to reach out and ask. As I said, this is probably a little bit more detailed than most of my outlines tend to be. Most of my outlines do tend to be a little bit less fleshed out and a lot more shorthand, but I didn't want to leave you guys confused or uncertain about the process. And sometimes shorthand is a little, if you're not the person who came up with the shorthand, it can sometimes be hard to understand exactly what the person means by it. So I wanted to really show you how each of the points relates back to the theme, and I didn't feel that that could be done if I used shorthand. So for the sake of not confusing you guys, this is written out in a lot more detail perhaps than I normally would do, unless required to turn in a sentence outline for a article for school. And for this project, I was not required to turn out a sentence outline to turn in, so most of this is not complete sentences. It is somewhere in between what I would normally do and what the teachers might require for a sentence by sentence outline. So, nevertheless, I hope that this has proven useful to you all. As I said, feel free to ask questions in the comments. If you have not yet watched the video on brainstorming, go ahead and do that, because I think that that's important to watch before you go trying to do this, because it's going to help you to understand the process of being intentional about thinking through your theme and show you kind of how I came up with some of the ideas. I used the exact same process to come up with the theme that I actually used. So even though this theme is wildly different from any of the themes that you see from the last video, which you can see here, and it obviously led to much, much different focuses for the article than what I had for the original ones. Even though that may be the case, this theme was still brought out of the same sort of thinking that I demonstrated in the video that I previously posted about the brainstorming process. So please do give that a watch. It is important. I think that it will be of use to you and give you a better place to start in doing this outlining portion. So if you haven't watched that, I'm going to go ahead and link that at the end of the video as well as in the description. Feel free to discuss in the comments below among yourselves as well. Just keep things polite and civil, please. And until next time, guys.